Mr. President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in times of confusion, loss of orientation, and increasing erosion of common sense threaten to undermine meaningful communication and to destroy the very preconditions of political cooperation. This also affects the topic of my annual report. When deciding to focus on the issue of violence committed in the name of religion, one of the main purposes was to propose adequate categories for describing phenomena, factors, root causes in this area. Finding adequate categories is not just an academic project, it ultimately is in the interest of clarifying the responsibility which different actors have in combating all forms of violence, justified or perpetrated in the name of religion. Violence committed in the name of religion can take different shapes. While in some countries terrorist groups invoke religion to justify atrocities such as mass execution, torture, arbitrary killings, gang rapes, enslavement, and expulsion, in other countries, religious vigilante groups harass minorities by vandalizing cemeteries, destroying property, and threatening physical attacks. State involvement with violence in the name of religion shows a broad variety, ranging from lack of capacity and de facto impunity to indirect or direct forms of complicity, sometimes even culminating in formal state endorsement and systematic orchestration of violence. Acts of violence in the name of religion frequently target individuals or groups branded as infidels, apostates, heretics, or blasphemers. The likelihood of violent attacks typically increases sharply when such offenses are enshrined in criminal codes. Violence can also be directed against people who are suspected of undermining national cohesion by allegedly acting in the interest of foreign powers or foreign donors. This frequently happens where a particular religion is used as a medium to define national identity. Moreover, vigilante groups, possibly with support from law enforcement, harass people, in particular women, whose ways of life are deemed immoral from the standpoint of certain narrowly defined religious code of conduct. Some religious leaders have contributed to creating a homophobic climate in which LGBT persons bear an increased risk of being physically attacked. While acts of violence in the name of religion disproportionately target minorities, they also affect followers of the same religion in whose name such violent acts are carried out. Voices of moderation or critics who openly oppose the abuse of religion for the justification of violence run a risk of being themselves charged with betrayal, blasphemy, or other offenses. The experience that religion is invoked in numerous acts of terrorism, civil war, communal violence, other forms of violence, causes some observers to use the label religion broadly and loosely when analyzing these phenomena. Violent conflicts are often described as mainly running along religious or denominational lines, for instance, between Muslims and Christians, Sunnis and Shias, Buddhists and Muslims, Hindus and Christians, etc. Such descriptions typically remain dramatically undercomplex, thus leading to grave misperceptions. A practical problem stemming from an isolated focus on religion in descriptions of violence, conflicts, and civil wars is that it may nourish fatalistic attitudes. The impression that seemingly perpetual religious or denominational differences lie at the root of the respective problems can exacerbate feelings of helplessness. If it's wrongly assumed that certain violent conflicts have their decisive root causes in religious strife that allegedly started centuries or millennia ago, this will likely distract attention from the responsibilities which governments, community leaders, civil society organizations, and others have today. Violence in the name of religion should therefore not be misperceived as a sort of natural outbreak of collective hatred supposedly originating from sectarian hostilities existing since time immemorial. The perpetrators of violent crimes are human beings who live in the 21st century and who invoke religious for the purpose of legitimizing, stoking, spreading, or escalating violence. The seeds of fanaticism, fortunately, do not always find fertile ground. Whereas in many societies, those promoting religious narrow-mindedness, intolerance, or violence remain rather marginalized, In other contexts, their opportunities to recruit followers may be higher. There are also societies in which the voices of fanaticism resonate strongly, and in some countries they have managed to infiltrate parts of the state apparatus or even lead governments. This accounts for the significance of broader political factors. Non-religious factors which deserve to be taken seriously include difficult historic legacies, a climate of political authoritarianism, social inequalities or caste hierarchies, ethnic fragmentation, rapid demographic changes, patriarchal values, the impact of a macho culture, migration processes, a gulf between urban and rural developments, breakdown of meaningful public discourse, lack of intergroup communication, endemic corruption and political cronyism, and something which I would like to highlight, a general loss of trust in public institutions. Any specific incidence of violence in the name of religion warrants a careful analysis of all relevant factors, including the broader political environment. It will become clear that religion is nowhere an isolated root cause of violent conflicts or attacks. At the same time, we have to note that the abuse of religion for the purpose of justifying or stoking violence is not only an abuse from outside, for instance by Machiavellian politicians, it can also be an abuse from within, as it were, that is by religious leaders themselves, leaders who have subscribed to polarizing interpretations of religious sources and traditions. That is why the religious motives and messages of those invoking religion for the purpose of justifying or preaching violence must be taken seriously. They should not be discarded. Although religious motives should not be seen in isolation from broader political factors, as said before, it would be wrong to dismiss polarizing religious interpretations as merely external excuses for acts of aggression whose real motives supposedly lie elsewhere. A full account of all the various factors lying at the root of the problem can help to build awareness of the joint responsibility that a broad range of actors has in fighting violence in the name of religion. Government representatives, religious communities, civil society organizations, the media should speak out quickly, clearly, and loudly against any acts of violence, thus overcoming the deafening silence as exists in some countries. Fighting a culture of impunity must be a priority. Interreligious communication has a key function in all agendas to prevent and overcome violence in the name of religion. People who regularly meet across boundaries will certainly realize that followers of other religions are not aliens with totally different mentalities. Civil society too can contribute to creating a peaceful and accommodating climate. It is important for individuals and groups targeted by aggressive propaganda to feel that they are not left alone and that others speak out on their behalf. Broad alliances can furthermore challenge entrepreneurs of hatred who often claim to represent a silent majority, a phrase very often used. The media play an indispensable role in bringing about a culture of public discourse. Where such a culture remains underdeveloped, hostile rumors remain unchecked and fearful narratives can hardly be exposed to public scrutiny and counter-narratives. A main message of the Rabat Plan of Action, which I fully endorse, is the call for making creative use of freedom of expression when countering hateful propaganda and incitement to acts of hatred. According to the Rabat Plan, the best antidote to hate speech is alternative speech in the sense of nuanced and precise media reporting, a fair representation of religions and other minorities in the media, fact-finding, including investigative journalism, in order to dispel myths and stereotypes. Governments have the overarching responsibility to combat violence committed in the name of religion. Based on respect for everyone's freedom of religion or belief, governments should provide an open, inclusive space and an open, inclusive framework in which religious diversity can unfold without discrimination and, above all, without fear. For this to be possible, they have to overcome any exclusivist settings, for example, the amalgamation of one particular religion or one particular type of religions with national identity. Governments should repeal restrictive legislation which typically has a chilling effect on religious minorities, dissidents, converts, also agnostics, atheists, but then also feminist theologians and many others, while at the same time encouraging vigilante groups to commit aggressive acts against such people. Government representatives should be the first to speak out quickly and clearly against any acts of violence committed in the name of religion, and they should take all available measures to bring perpetrators to justice. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, attached to my annual report you find reports on the visits that I undertook to Kazakhstan and Vietnam. I would like to thank the governments of Kazakhstan and Vietnam for having facilitated these visits. In Kazakhstan, I experienced a society characterized by religious pluralism, with Sunni Muslims and Orthodox and other Christians constituting the largest religious communities. The government is committed to upholding the climate of peaceful inter-religious coexistence, including by organizing interreligious dialogue at central, regional, and local levels. The generally relaxed attitude towards religious pluralism in the country, however, does not equally include members of small religious groups, often branded as sects. A major issue in our discussions concerned the compulsory registration of religious communities in order to be recognized. Those groups of believers which fail to obtain registration or which do not wish to have such a status are deemed illegal in the country and cannot exercise any community functions. In this context, I would like to underline that any administrative procedures established for obtaining a particular legal status should always be based on the understanding that freedom of religion or belief, due to its nature as a universal human right, inheres in all human beings and ultimately originates from the respect for their inalienable human dignity. The enjoyment of people's right to freedom of religion or belief, including its community dimension, should thus be respected as being prior to and finally independent of administrative approval. Vietnam, too, is home to a broad variety of religions that coexist in peace. Religious practices are possible and even encouraged in the country, provided, however, they remain within the established channels. Most interlocutors whom I met in Vietnam agreed that the conditions have improved in recent decades, particularly if compared to the situation immediately after unification in 1975. However, the stipulations imposed on religious or belief community in order to operate in compliance with the law are far-reaching and cumbersome, thus creating a rather restrictive atmosphere. Religious or belief communities that insist on autonomy vis-à-vis the authorities live in unsafe conditions and face systematic harassment and intimidation. I personally have seen clear evidence of human rights violations, including police raids, destructions of houses of worship, disruption of religious services, imprisonment and physical attack, even incidents of torture, killings, other forms of persecution. Unfortunately, some of the people who had agreed to talk to me were physically barred from meeting me, being placed in situations of de facto house arrest. Other people whom I did meet were exposed to reprisals, in some cases even physical attacks, brutal physical attacks, during my visit or immediately afterwards. Moreover, the privacy of some conversation was violated. The situation escalated to such a degree that some planned meetings and discussions could not take place. This was in blatant violation of the terms of reference for country visit by special rapporteurs. I find these incidents all the more regrettable against the background of certain indicators of a careful opening up of the country. I thank you for your attention.